In this video, we're going to take our first look at Blender when we're coming from a Fusion 360 background. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we want to get started learning how to work in Blender. Now, Blender is something that I've covered several times, and I can't say it enough that I am by no means a Blender expert. There are tons of great tutorials out there on Blender if you want to learn it in depth. But what I want to focus on is the workflow coming from Fusion 360 or another parametric CAD program. Now, I found over the past few years that I've had trouble picking up Blender. So I'm going to talk about the differences between a CAD program and a mesh or a poly program like Blender, and some of the things that I've learned along the way. So first, if you're like me and you've been using 3D CAD packages, maybe it's SolidWorks or Inventor or Fusion 360 or any other parametric CAD program, you're used to doing things a certain way. If you're coming from a graphics design or visual effects background, then you probably are more familiar with modeling in mesh or poly like we do in Blender. So the first thing that I want to note is when I got started trying to learn Blender, the first thing I did, which is what most people do, is I simply went to YouTube and I typed in Blender tutorial. One of the first ones that came up was from Blender Guru. Andrew Price had this tutorial where you model a donut, you add all the details, you render it, and it was basically a start to finish thing. And you can see here that in his version 2.8, 11 million people have already looked at this in 2 years. It's extremely popular. He's updated it a few times, but I really wasn't able to replicate what he did after the fact. And what I mean by that is I was able to follow along. I did everything that he did in the videos, but when I tried to repeat the process and apply it to something else, I felt like I was just falling short. I just didn't really retain the knowledge that I learned. So I kind of put Blender away and then I came back to it again. So the next thing I did was I looked for physics. So when I did this, I was looking for animations. I was trying to do some physics rendering. And again, I found a couple videos and I followed along. I was able to do some physical simulation, have rigid bodies hitting each other. I was able to do some fluids, and I really thought that I had this nailed. But every time I went back and I tried to apply it on my own, I still felt like I was falling short, like I just skipped over the fundamentals. And I did this with a couple different things. I looked at camera tracking, I looked at rendering, I looked at character modeling, and every time I was able to follow along with what I saw, and then I just kind of felt like I wasn't able to apply it after the fact. So if that sounds like you, then hopefully you've come to the right place. I plan on doing a series trying to connect some dots between the parametric CAD workflow and Blender, and I plan to go into Blender extremely slowly. However, in this first video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the modeling approach in Fusion 360. We're going to do a little bit of form modeling. We're going to identify a handful of tools that we use commonly in the forms workflow, and then we're going to replicate that process in Blender. Now, after this video and the rest of the series, I'm going to carry on exploring the Blender interface, talking about tools that we need. I plan on avoiding using shortcut keys, and I want to focus solely on locating the tools in the menus. This was a critical step for me in trying to figure out what things did and where they were located, and not just relying on shortcut keys. So first, let's get started, and you want to make sure that if you've never used Blender before, that you go to the link in the description and you download and install Blender 3.0. There are lots of different versions out there. Blender is free and open source, and it is a wonderful tool, and I strongly recommend, even if you don't plan using it for any of your actual work, that you should download it, install it, and at least get a familiar or some basic understanding with it. So to get started in Fusion 360, the first thing that I want to mention is that we have 4 main different types of workflows in Fusion. Now, when I say 4, it's really like 3.5, and I'm not going to count Paramesh as a workflow, partially because Paramesh is something that's only available to commercial and EDU licenses, and you can't use the Paramesh tools if you're on a hobby license. Knowing that a lot of people are on hobby licenses, then I really want to talk about these 3.5 different types of workflows. So when I say that, I'm talking specifically about solids, surfaces, sheet metal, and then the half workflow is going to be what we consider direct modeling. So inside of here, when we're creating parametric models, we typically go in and we start with a sketch. We'll use sketch tools like lines, rectangles, and arcs. We'll give these things dimensions. And at this point, don't worry about following along. We're just explaining some of the different workflows and the differences. So all you really need to do is just be comfortable with understanding the differences. So here we're going to extrude this into 3D, and now we've created a 3D B-rep. This B-rep, or boundary representation, is the mathematical equivalent of the solid volume or body that we have. Basically, using math and representing the vertices and edges and faces based on the math behind it gives us nice, clean geometry. This is critical when we're talking about manufacturing. If we were going to machine this block or if we were going to mold it, we need that critical information to get these clean surface and solid bodies. When we talk about creating surfaces, the workflow is extremely similar. We typically would create sketches, and we would do things like extrude, revolve, sweep to build them into 3D. Since we're on the surface tools, I'm going to just simply delete the top face of the solid, which automatically converts it to a surface. A surface is just a face representation, but these are still considered B-reps. We can use these surfaces to cut solids, replace solid faces, or we can turn them into solids themselves. The form workflow, which is T-spline functionality, is something that we've explored a lot on this channel. We've used it to model cars and car features, and we've also done a series on Fusion Form Mastery where I looked at most of the tools inside of the toolset. Now, the forms workflow is the most akin to Blender workflow, so we're going to get into that one last. Now, when I mentioned that there were 3.5-ish workflows, the third and a half, I don't really know how to say that one, is going to be direct modeling. Now, typically when we're talking about parametric CAD, we're really interested in capturing a timeline or history. But Fusion 360 is actually really good at what's called direct modeling. And sometimes in the conceptual phase, you might want to turn off capture history or create what's called a base feature. Now, the base feature in Fusion 360 allows us to model history-free. When we're talking about modeling in Blender, this is typically done in a history-free nature, just like when we're working in forms. In Fusion 360, we can go down and turn off Capture Design History, and then we're working directly on the body. We can still do things like apply fillets to corners, we can make changes or adjust the shape. For example, if we want to shell this design, we can create a thin wall body. We can decide to move the bottom face by using direct tools like press pull, and we can adjust all sorts of details. At some point, we might decide that we're ready or we're done with the conceptual phase, and we can begin to capture design history again. So that workflow can be very helpful depending on what you're doing. Now, this is not even getting into the fact that we have bodies and components, assemblies and assembly joints, and we can replicate the mechanical motion. These are all aspects of the parametric CAD modeling process. And again, we're not really going to get into that aspect, but now we want to focus on creating forms. Now, forms, again, is going to be the most closely aligned to what we can do in Blender. We're going to begin with a very simple example, starting with create primitive box. Just pick a plane and create a box shape. We're going to bring this up into 3D, and we're going to say OK. Every time you start a new design in Blender, you're going to start with a cube. That's the default, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. What I want to do for this example is I'm going to go to Utilities, Display Mode, and I'm going to change to Box Display Mode. Box Display Mode is more aligned with what we're going to see in Blender. The other mode that we have that shows this box or cage display on the outside and shows the smooth body on the inside is very similar to what we're going to see when we apply a subdivision surface modifier in our Blender environment. So just make note that we're controlling the control cage or the box on the outside, but ultimately what we're getting underneath is a clean B-rep surface or solid body when we finish our form. This is going to be the main difference between the modeling approach in Blender and Fusion. In Blender, we're directly modeling the mesh, and all we're ever going to get out of it is a mesh. In Fusion, we can consider that we're modeling or working on a mesh, even though it's a control cage. And ultimately, what we're going to get out of it is a clean BREP solid or surface body. So what I want to do at this point is, again, continue on in box display mode and talk about some of the tools that we're going to use in both Fusion and Blender. Once again, this is going to be a somewhat simple follow-along project, so make sure that you are in Fusion 360, you're in the Forms contextual environment, and that you have created a box. One of the basic functions or features inside of the Forms workspace is to be able to manipulate vertices, edges, and faces. Now in Fusion 360, we do that using Edit Form. We have taken a look at Edit by Curve in a previous video, and I'm not going to be talking about that in this lesson. We're going to focus on Edit Form, and there are a few things that I do want to mention or note. When we have Edit Form, we can use a multi-transform mode, which allows us to select a vertex, an edge, or a face. Then we can rotate, scale, or move it, and this can be in a single axis or in plane. We can change these types individually to translate, rotate, and scale, but we do have this multi-mode. This is going to be one difference when we're working in Blender, as we're going to have to pick if we want to translate, rotate, or scale individually. Also note that we have coordinate spaces, and we've taken a look at this before. Typically we use the world space, which will align with X, Y, and Z. We can also align to our view, we can align to our selection space, or we can align local per entity. This is going to be similar to how we can manipulate things in Blender, with the simple change in the fact that we're going to be orienting our adjustments based on local selections or potentially with a set pivot. Now in Fusion 360, it's considered set pivot, but in Blender, we have different ways where we can manipulate the location or the basis for our transform, our scale, or our rotate. In Fusion 360, we have soft modifications, which allows us to make a selection and determine how far it's going to influence the body. This is shown on screen by colorization of the vertices from red to pink to white. Blender has the same option, and that's something we're going to take a look at in future videos, but just note that there are some similarities to soft modification and the way that we can manipulate geometry in Blender. We do have selection options as well. Things where we can grow or shrink the loops or rings that we select, we can identify features, and we can even invert selections. We do have a lot of different selection options in Blender, and these are things that we are going to talk about in future videos. Now that we have a basic understanding of Edit Form, let's select Cancel, and let's talk a little bit more about some of the other tools that we're going to need. In Fusion 360, when we're modeling, being able to insert edges and insert points, as well as weld vertices, are some of the main tools that we use to create smooth and complex geometry. So let's just identify and focus on the way that these tools work, so that way we can draw some parallels with Blender. First, if we've decided that we've added too many divisions to our cube, we can double-click an edge to grab the entire loop, and we can hit Delete on the keyboard. Fusion 360 automatically removes that edge and patches the surrounding geometry. So now each of these edges is a single edge without a break in the middle. This is a very easy way that we can modify by adding or removing edges from our design. In Blender, when we work on this, we're going to have to choose from deleting an edge, a face, or a vertice, or by using a dissolve. We'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into Blender. Next, we can use Insert Edge. And again, what we can do is we can insert edges, and we have options for things like single or both, and we can change the insertion mode to simple or exact. This is one of the main differences between inserting edges in Fusion 360 and Blender, because ultimately, underneath the hood, what we're doing is we're controlling a smooth BREP surface or solid body. Now, in Blender, we're working directly on the mesh, and we're not going to have the option to create a simple insert, which allows it to change the shape of the underlying body, or an exact insert, which makes it maintain its current shape and simply adds the edge or inserts the edge wherever it's needed. Also, in addition to inserting edges, we have Modify and Insert Point. This allows us to make selections along an edge and insert new edges as needed. One of the main differences between this tool and the tool called Knife Cut in Blender is the fact that in Blender, we can make selections on a face in between edges, where in Fusion 360, we have to go all the way to another edge in order to make this work. Let's go ahead and delete this edge and just take a look at manipulating the shape of this box. Under Modify, we also have a Subdivide command. This is something that we don't use very often, but Subdivide also has a simple and an exact option. When we use simple, it's going to subdivide our currently selected face. When we have exact, it's going to create a subdivision to maintain the underlying shape. We also have a specify option, which allows us to determine the number of edges that we use in each direction. Note how this changes our curvature and the underlying shape. If I go back and forth between smooth and box display, you can see our smooth and box display are much closer in line than they were originally without the subdivision. If I change this to 1 in both directions, you can see that we're back to the original cube. So the subdivision modifier in this case, or subdivide in Fusion 360, allows us to take our geometry and divide it up into more faces. Again, when we use simple, it's going to modify the underlying geometry and just add the edges or faces where they're selected. We're going to hit cancel for subdivide, and we'll talk about that more in Blender as it has more of an effect there. Let's go ahead and use Modify Edit Form and just create some simple changes here. I'm going to select an edge and I'm going to pull it up in the Z direction. Then I want to select a face and I want to pull the entire face in the X direction. You can see how we're adjusting the design. And if I use Alt or Option if you're on a Mac and the number 2, we're going to go into this intermediate display. If you go to your selection options, you can also choose Control Frame Display from here. This is going to allow us to see the underlying shape that we're creating. You can see here it looks kind of like an egg. We can rotate our selected face. We can move it around in plane, or we can pick a single direction that we want to move. We also have the option to scale it up or down, and this can be done again in plane, in a single direction, or in all three at the same time. So this is the basic method that we will use when we begin modifying geometry in Fusion 360. Now let's draw some parallels with how we do that in Blender. First, I'm going to open Blender 3.0 and we're going to start a new general file. Every time you start a new file, you'll be presented with a camera, a light, and this cube mesh body. The first thing that we're going to do in this example is we're going to go over to this right-hand side where we see Scene Collection, and we're going to hide the camera and the light as they aren't important for our example. Next, we're going to take an extremely quick look at the user interface and identify the areas of concern for us. First, the main area is going to be this upper left-hand quadrant. We have some tools that we see on the left-hand side. We have some menus across the top, and note that we are going to be staying in this layout menu. There are plenty of other tabs or areas where we could go into things like sculpting or UV editing, but these are much more advanced techniques, and we're really going to just draw some similarities between what we did in Fusion. Another area where we want to make sure we identify is the upper right-hand section where we have our coordinate system. This is very similar to the view cube in Fusion 360 because we can click on these and we can change the view very quickly and easily. Also, it's important to note that this bottom right-hand section is going to be where we come to do things like add modifiers. Later on in this example, we'll be adding a subdivision surface modifier and seeing how that affects our design. Before we get started modeling anything or making any adjustments, we need to make sure that we're comfortable moving the object around. Holding down the middle mouse button allows us to free rotate the design. Holding down the Shift key and using the middle mouse button allows us to pan. And then scrolling the middle mouse wheel allows us to zoom in and out. This is a little bit different to Fusion 360, but just note that you should get comfortable with this. A lot of people like to configure or customize the way in which you manipulate models based on the other software that they use. I actually prefer to keep all the software packages I use as their default installs for a few different reasons. For me, the Parametric CAD workflow in Fusion 360 and the workflow in Blender is very different. We're going to draw some similarities, but I think it's important mentally for us to be able to make the distinction between what we're doing in one software over the other. So coming into Blender, it's good for me to sort of readjust or reorient myself to a slightly different modeling approach and shortcut keys to make sure that I can quickly and easily make that mental jump to working in a different software. Now, that's not true for everybody, so if you do want to make some customizations, you can always go into Edit and Preferences and you can adjust your preferences to suit. We're not going to be covering that in this video. Now that we understand how to manipulate and move around, let's go ahead and select the object, in this case our cube. We're going to go up to the upper left-hand section and change from Object Mode to Edit Mode. As soon as we do that, some more tools are presented and some more menus across the top. You'll also note that the display of our cube has changed. We now see highlighted faces, edges, and vertices. The first thing that I want to note is the selection process is going to be dictated by our selection up here. This is going to be a vertex selection, an edge selection, or a face selection. By default, if you select enough vertices to select a closed face region, it'll automatically highlight. If we left click, we can go ahead and deselect everything. Then we can select each of these vertices holding down the Shift key, and as soon as we select all four, that top face is fully highlighted. Again, it's important to remember that in Fusion 360 we have the multi option that allows us to create our selection simply based on what we're clicking on. In Blender, we want to make sure that we do identify what we want to work with before we make that selection, or just make sure that you're on the right option. Also note on the left-hand side, we have a lot of different tools. Anytime you see a small arrow in the bottom right-hand corner, that means that there are more tools at your disposal and you need to hold down the left mouse button to access those. Some of the main tools that we want to identify are going to be our selections, which in this video, we're simply going to manually click edge, vertices, or faces. We also want to note that we have move, rotate, and scale. These are going to be the three main ways in which we manipulate our object. Also note as we scroll down that we do have a couple of other options here. For example, there's an add option, and if we hold down the left mouse button, you can see that we have things like cubes, cylinders, and UV spheres. This is a way in which we can add new mesh objects, but we're going to get into that in future videos. Some of the main tools that we do want to identify are going to be things like the loop cut, the knife, as well as just manually manipulating the geometry. I also want to make sure that we understand that the menus at the top are going to be based on our selection. So for example, Vertex has tools that are associated with the selection of vertices. Things like extrude, connect vertices, and rip vertices. Also note that we have options for edges. Things like extruding and beveling edges. We have subdivide, edge slide, loop cut and slide, and so on. We have options for faces. We have options for UV, and we also have options for mesh. Sometimes if you can't find an option or a tool, it might be located on the mesh menu. For example, merge is located on the mesh menu, even though it can apply to vertices, edges, and faces. The same is true for delete. Delete can be used on vertices, edges, and faces, but it's found on the mesh menu and not on each individual menu. Each of these menus and most of the options will also have shortcut keys. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to try extremely hard to avoid using shortcut keys, as I find it makes it a little bit more difficult to understand where everything is and what we're doing. So we're going to take it extremely slow and make sure that we can identify where all the tools are before we get comfortable and progress into using shortcut keys. I will say that even after playing around with Blender for quite a while, and I do still consider myself very much a novice, I keep a running list of the tools that I use constantly. I have that document open when I'm modeling, and it's sort of a reminder to tell me what some of the tools do. I recently went through the process of learning character modeling, creating rigging using an armature, doing UV unwrapping and applying appearances, creating animations, and then exporting that into a VR environment. Through this process, I had to learn a whole lot of new tools and new workflows. But because I spent the time to identify where a lot of these tools are and really understand the basics of manipulating geometry, it was much easier for me to make the jump into those new techniques, knowing that I had learned some of the basics. Now that we've identified a couple of different areas and things that are going to be important to us, let's start manipulating some geometry. Just like in Fusion 360, I'm going to begin by selecting this edge, Then I want to pick the tool that I want to use, in this case move. When I select move, you'll notice that a coordinate system or a manipulator appears based on our selection. If we select multiple edges by holding down the Shift key and clicking another edge, you'll notice that this displays directly in the middle of our selection. If we add another one, you can see that it moves based on our selection. For this example, let's go ahead and just select this upper horizontal edge. If we change our view to X, you can see that we only see the Z and the Y coordinate system. Remember, holding down Shift and the middle mouse button will allow us to pan to place it in view. Once we're here, we can move along a single axis, in this case Y or Z, or we can use this small option in the middle to move in plane. You'll notice that the plane option is colored based on the X coordinate, and then we have Y and Z. If we rotate this around, you'll notice that we open up the third axis. This allows us to move in X or move in plane, in this case the XZ plane. And if we were to rotate this around, you can see the small blue plane displayed there for X and Y. The same is true if we were to change over to face selection and select this end face. We can move it in Y, we can move it in Z, or we can move it in X. Now let's take a look at rotation. Once again, we have a coordinate system or manipulator displayed. We can see that we can rotate the face about the X-axis, we can rotate it about Y, or we can rotate it about Z. Also note when we move over to scale that we have a very similar coordinate system displayed. We can scale in just the Z direction, just the Y direction, just the X direction, or we can scale in plane. This can be extremely helpful once we begin modeling. And once again, there are plenty of shortcut keys to make this happen. In this case, the scale shortcut key is S on the keyboard. Once we get into learning those shortcuts, we can also identify different ways in which we can scale in just a single direction or scale in plane. But for right now, again, we are going to focus on using these tools. One important thing to note is that even if we deselect our face, our tool is still active. While this can be helpful, it's a good idea to remember to go back to your selection, and that way you make sure that you're not accidentally manipulating your geometry. Now that we've made some slight manipulations, let's talk about some of the options to add new edges. I'm going to begin with Loop Cut. When I select Loop Cut, I also want to go to my Edge selection menu, and notice that we get a preview on the screen. Loop cuts are an important part of modeling in Blender, and it does help us identify whether or not we have good edge flow. Sometimes if you can't create a loop cut, it means that your edge flow is not consistent with the shape of your model. In this case, you can see that we're very easily able to divide our model up into 3 different orientations. For this example, I'm going to left click here and notice that it's automatically placed it, and now I'm moving on to placing another edge. I'm going to hit Escape to get off of my loop cut selection and go back to my selection dialog. The reason I want to do this is because in this case, I'm going to go up to Edge, and notice that we have another option called Loop Cut and Slide. The Loop Cut and Slide option is extremely helpful because it allows us to click an area where we want to place an edge. And again, we can move this around. And once we place that, then we have the ability to slide it all the way to its extents. If you decide that you've slid it too far, you can use the right click and it'll place it directly in the middle. Again, the tool is not active in this case because we haven't selected it over here, so we will need to reselect that. This is where it becomes extremely important to identify shortcuts that you use often. This one is Control and R. You also note that there is an offset edge slide, Shift, Control, and R. You'll notice a common theme when we find shortcut keys, for example, R, Control R, and Shift, Control R, are all various controls that we can use for things like edge cuts. Next, let's take a look at the knife cut option. Once again, we're going to select this, and now what we can do is we can begin to create cuts across our geometry. Remember I mentioned that unlike in Fusion 360, the knife cut can create edges along the middle of faces, so this can be extremely handy when we're trying to retopologize something. Once we're done, we simply hit Enter on the keyboard, and now we've created these new edge divisions. We might want to connect these corners here and then hit Enter to finish that off. It's important to note that there are other options. You can see here that we've got this bisect option. Again, to get off of this tool, we're going to come up and we're going to make sure that we use the selection and go back to our selection dialog. If we've decided that we've added too many edges and we want to remove some, we need to use delete. But once again, delete is an option that we'll find on the mesh menu and not on the individual menus for vertex, edge, or face. Also note that there are two main different types of deletes that we want to be mindful of. We have the delete option for edges, and then we have dissolve edges. Let's go ahead and select a single edge, in this case one that we just added, go to Mesh, Delete, and select Delete Edge. Notice that not only the edge is deleted, but all the faces that were connected with it. I'm going to use Control and Z or undo from the Edit menu. In this case, I want to go to Delete and select Dissolve Edge. When we use Dissolve Edge, this is very similar to deleting an edge in Fusion 360. This is going to be the most common option that we're going to use. I am going to talk about one shortcut key that's extremely handy, simply because the way that we do this in Fusion 360 is by double-clicking on an edge to get an entire loop. When we're working in Blender, if we want to select an entire loop, we can hold down the Alt key, and the Alt key will allow us to select that entire loop. If we hold down the Control key or Command on a Mac, and we make an edge selection, it's going to automatically connect a path between them. This is true if we're on faces or if we're on vertices as well. So you can see here it's creating a path between. This makes it very easy for us to create connections between faces very quickly and easily. Let's go ahead and try this with vertices. If I hold down Control and I select over here, you can see that it created the shortest path. This goes from this corner over to here. If I hold down Control still, I can carry on making those selections and again, very quickly and easily find and select those edges or vertices. Let's go ahead and select this edge, hold down Control, select this, go to Mesh, Delete, and Dissolve Edges. Now we're back to a more simplified version. For this example, I'm going to get out of edit mode and go back into object mode, and note that we still have a very boxy or cube looking object. What we want to do now is we want to talk a little bit about modifiers, as they're going to be extremely important to the modeling process in Blender. To add a modifier, we need to go over to the right hand side and select the modifier properties or the wrench icon. Making sure that we do have our cube or our object selected, we're going to add modifier. Notice that there are four main categories: modify, generate, deform, and physics. The physics options in Blender are extremely handy. Now, if you're just trying to make an engineering simulation, or if you're trying to make animations, you can add things like particle systems, soft bodies, and you can use things like cloth or collisions. For deform, we can use this tool to modify our geometry. For example, if we want to use the option to create a curve or do a simple deform, we can actually manipulate our solid bodies and wrap them around. These can be, again, extremely handy, simplifying the modeling process to keeping things fairly boxy, and then using these modifiers to change their shape. But for us, we're going to focus right now on the generate section, and specifically subdivision surface. When we select this, you'll notice that a modifier appears. We've got levels in the viewport and levels in the render. If we modify this, you can see that as we increase the levels in the viewport, we're getting more and more divisions. However, if we change our display in the upper right hand corner to viewport shading, you'll notice that we're not really seeing any additional. You can see as we reduce this or increase it, it still looks like the same number of edges. And that's because we haven't applied this modifier. What we're going to do is go back to our shaded display. We're going to pick a 3. And while we have this in our modifier stack, I'm going to go back into edit mode. In edit mode, you'll now see that our original object is displayed on the outside and that we have that smooth body on the inside. This is very similar to that display that we used in Fusion 360, where we could modify and manipulate the control cage or the box on the outside, and we saw the smooth design on the inside. One key difference here is that the object on the inside is still a mesh made up of tessellated faces, or in this case, quads. So you'll note that we do have a couple options in subdivision. We can turn this on and off to display in edit mode. We can turn it on and off in the display or on and off for rendering. Let's go ahead and get out of edit mode and go back to object mode. And this time we're going to use this arrow. We're going to select apply. The modifier disappears from our modifier stack. And now if we go back into edit mode, you'll see that we've applied it to our body, and now we've increased the number of edges, vertices, and faces that we have. This is a problem when we begin adding and applying these modifiers if you haven't created the shape that you're interested in yet. This is why it's very important for us to continue to work in low poly modeling as long as possible, because our designs will get much harder for us to control. While we do have this subdivision surface applied, let's go ahead and take a look at one more option before we finish this example. I'm going to use the vertex selection, and I'm going to change my option to move. I'm going to select a vertex, and then I'm going to come up to the top center of my screen, and I want to turn on proportional editing. When we turn on proportional editing, this is going to allow us to make adjustments to the amount of the body that are going to be affected. However, you'll notice when we do this and display it on the screen that we don't get this large circle until we begin moving. What's actually happening with this is we're going to have to use the scroll wheel while we're holding down the left mouse button to determine how much of this we want to move. If I let go of the left mouse wheel, you can see we're back to zooming in. So when we're using the tools or the options on the left-hand side, we're going to have to hold down the left mouse button and then use this proportional editing option to determine how much or little that will affect. Again, the bigger or the larger that circle is, the more of the body that's going to be generally affected. If we zoom in, we're going to be affecting a very small portion of the design. So you can see this can make it very easy for us to make general changes if we've gone too far and we've applied a subdivision surface modifier. But there are other ways in which we can do this. There are different options where we can determine if this is smooth, if we've got inverse, constant, random, and these options are going to be very similar across the board in Blender for things like UV shading and texture painting. For this example, however, we're just going to go ahead and leave this as is. We're going to hop out of edit mode and go back into object mode. Now that we have this object, what do? Well, from this point, we do nothing because this was just a basic first example. I do think it's extremely important for you to get comfortable going back and forth between object mode and edit mode. And I do think it's extremely important for you to be able to identify a handful of basic tools. You need to be able to find move, rotate, and scale, as those are going to be critical to modifying geometry in Blender. Then you also need to be extremely comfortable with inserting edges using loop cut and using the knife tool. The knife tool is going to be less important as we get started because it's a little bit more advanced for us to create or insert edges and vertices where we need them. But it will be extremely important for us to be able to insert loop cuts as well as use the loop cut and slide. This will be extremely helpful once we get started adding edges to help control curvature. There are a lot more topics that we will cover as we progress, but these are some of the basics. When we start creating and manipulating geometry, we're also going to be taking a look at extruding, insetting faces, and beveling. These are going to be great ways for us to make drastic changes to our geometry relatively quickly. Also remember that some of the options are going to be based on our selection, going between vertex, edge, and face mode, and being able to find different tools on different menus without having to rely on shortcuts. We will get to the point where we are going to focus on using shortcuts, but for right now, I do think it's extremely important that you do find your way around Blender without relying on shortcuts. This is one of the biggest pitfalls that I had when trying to learn, is instead of finding where tools were and learning how I could access them, I just wrote down the shortcut keys that were used in tutorials and I tried to rely on that. And what ended up happening is it just simply fell short when I needed to apply a tool and I just couldn't find it. So make sure that you do search around and note that the menus are extremely helpful. Vertex gives us a lot of options that we can use when vertices are selected. Edges gives us a lot of options that we can use on edge selections, and faces options for selected faces. Mesh is a great menu that allows us to apply different tools that can be applied most of the time for vertices, edges, faces, or entire mesh bodies. We haven't really talked about view, select, or even the add menu, and we're not going to talk about UV for quite some time. But just note that these also have very important tools and options that will become more applicable later on. At this point, make sure that you continue to play around with this, and if you want to, go ahead and save it when you're done, or start a whole new file, start with a brand new box, and continue to play with that. In the next video, I plan to slow down a little bit more and focus more on the user interface before we start a project. I don't have a specific project in mind, but if there's anything that you would like to see, please leave me a comment. And also, if you've followed along or you've started to learn Blender on your own and you've had any problems, I'd like to hear those as well. If you're kind of in the same boat as me, you've tried to learn Blender, but it's just kind of overwhelming, hopefully that this series is going to help you learn at a much slower pace. Again, I don't intend to replace any content that's already out there. There are dozens of great channels made by professionals in the field that know exactly what they're doing. But I found that there's a little bit of a gap to getting started coming from a CAD background and even being at a place where you can understand and follow along with tutorials. So hopefully I can bridge that gap and get a few more people using Blender. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below or send me an email, support@caducator.com. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.